1931, archaeologist Erich Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania pulled a fragmentary clay tablet from the ruins of Shuruppak, a city buried beneath the desert of southern Iraq. The tablet was Sumerian. It predated the biblical flood account by more than 1,000 years, and it didn't describe a generic disaster. It named a specific storm, attributed it to a specific source, and gave a specific duration, 7 days and 7 nights. While Schmidt was cataloging the tablet, his team was digging through the city itself. What they found beneath the streets stopped the excavation cold, a 60-centimetre layer of alluvial sand and clay sealing the entire settlement, deposited in a single event. The tablet described a storm that should not have been physically possible in southern Mesopotamia, and the dirt under the city said the storm happened. If forbidden history fascinates you, subscribe now. What's coming next will not leave you comfortable. To understand why this tablet is so impossible, you need to understand what the Sumerians were supposed to know about their own weather. They were not primitive sky watchers cowering at thunder. They were systematic observers. They tracked river cycles, rainfall patterns, and seasonal floods across generations, recording the data on clay tablets with the same methodical precision they applied to the stars. Southern Mesopotamia had a documented climate, and the Sumerians documented it. Spring inundation from snowmelt in the Anatolian highlands, irregular but predictable. Mild winter rains, long dry summers. Their entire civilization was built around managing this rhythm. Their canals, their cities, their agricultural calendar, all of it calibrated to weather they understood. According to mainstream Assyriology, the flood myth emerged from this normal pattern, a particularly bad year of seasonal flooding, exaggerated across centuries of retelling, eventually inflated into apocalyptic scale. A literary device, a moral lesson dressed in weather. That's the safe interpretation, the one that keeps the tablet comfortable. But the tablet doesn't describe a flood, it describes a storm. Specifically, it describes a wind event. The text speaks of Adad, the storm god, roaring in the clouds, the deluge bellowing like a bull, the wind resounding like a screaming eagle, darkness so total that the sun disappeared from the sky for the duration of the event. These are not the descriptions of seasonal flooding. These are not the words a scribe reaches for when describing a swollen river. This is something else. And here is the problem mainstream scholarship cannot resolve. The kind of weather event the tablet describes, sustained continental scale storm winds, atmospheric obscuration blotting out the sun for a week, total darkness across an entire region, does not happen in southern Mesopotamia. It cannot happen there. The latitude forbids it. The geography forbids it. The climate system that governs the Tigris-Euphrates basin produces nothing remotely like it. So why did the most precise observers of the ancient world, a civilization that documented Venus to within minutes of modern measurements, record a storm that their landscape was incapable of producing? They were not exaggerating. They were not inventing. The Sumerians wrote down what they saw. The question is what they saw. In March 1931, Erich Schmidt arrived at the mound of Tel Farah in central Iraq, leading a joint expedition from the University of Pennsylvania and the American Schools of Oriental Research. He had been prompted to dig by reports of illicit excavation in the area, and the site had a name that any Assyriologist would recognize. Tel Farah was ancient Shuruppak, the city named in the flood tablet itself as the home of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. Schmidt brought with him a young epigraphist named Samuel Noah Kramer, who would later become one of the most respected Sumerologists of the 20th century. What they found in 6 weeks of digging changed how a small group of researchers privately understood the flood account, even as the public conclusion remained cautious. Beneath the early dynastic occupation layer, sandwiched directly above the Jemdet Nazar levels dating to roughly 3000 BCE, Schmidt's team uncovered a 60-centimeter band of yellow alluvial sand and clay. It was deposited in a single event. It was not gradual silting. It was not the residue of seasonal flooding accumulated over decades. It was a catastrophe layer sealed by reoccupation centuries later, when survivors or newcomers built a new city on top of the sediment that had drowned the old one. Schmidt was not the first to find such a layer. 2 years earlier, in 1929, Charles Leonard Wally had announced a similar deposit at UR, though dated significantly older, around 3,500 BCE. Stephen Langdon and L. Watlin had found multiple flood layers at Kish in the same decade. But Schmidt's discovery at Shuruppak was different. It matched the city named in the tablet. It dated to roughly the period the Sumerian king list identified as antediluvian. Schmidt himself wrote in the Penn Museum Journal that the flood story seemed to be based on a very real event. Then mainstream archaeology moved on. The dirt confirms a flood. The tablet describes a storm. What kind of weather event leaves both signatures in the same place at the same time? And why does the description carved into the clay match no climate phenomenon known to southern Iraq, then or now? The questions were buried with the layer. To understand what the tablet actually says, you have to read it the way a meteorologist would, not the way a theologian has been taught to. The most complete version is the Atrahasis epic, recorded in 3 tablets during the reign of the Babylonian king Ammi-Saduqa between 1647 BCE and 1626 BCE, but drawing on Sumerian source material that is centuries older. 3 phrases in the storm passage have been softened, metaphorized, or quietly dismissed by mainstream translators. Once you correct them, you are no longer reading mythology. First, Adad roared in the clouds. Adad is the storm god, and that has allowed scholars to treat his name as religious decoration. But in non-mythological tablets, in administrative records, in agricultural reports, Adad's name is used as a literal weather marker. A scribe writing Adad in those contexts is writing thunderstorm, the same way a modern forecaster writes lightning. Second, the wind resounded like a screaming eagle. This is not a poetic flourish. Eagles scream when they dive at speed. The simile describes sustained high-velocity wind, not a passing squall. Third, the darkness was dense, the sun was gone. This is total atmospheric obscuration, the kind produced by airborne particulates so heavy that daylight cannot penetrate it, the kind associated with volcanic injection or massive dust loading. Pull the 3 threads together and you are not reading a flood story. You are reading a meteorological observation, a sustained storm system with extreme wind, total darkness, and torrential rain, persisting for 7 days and 7 nights without break. Now apply that to the geography. A frontal system in southern Iraq lasts hours, occasionally a day or 2 when conditions stall. 7 days of unbroken sustained wind, total darkness, and continuous rainfall in this latitude is not weather. It is a regime change. It is the signature of a continent-scale atmospheric disturbance, the kind of event produced by major volcanic injection into the stratosphere, an oceanic impact, or an abrupt and violent climate transition. The Sumerian observers logged exactly that. The tablet describes 1. Schmidt's team dated the alluvial layer beneath Shuruppak to roughly 2900 BCE. That date matters more than any researcher in 1931 could have known, because something else was happening in the climate record around 2900 BCE. Modern paleoclimatology has a name for the kind of event the tablet describes. It is called an abrupt climate transition. The most famous example is the 4.2 kilo-year event, a documented aridification pulse that collapsed civilizations across the Near East, North Africa, and the Indus Valley around 2200 BCE. The Akkadian Empire fell during it. Egypt's old kingdom dissolved. The Indus Valley cities were abandoned. But the 4.2 kilo-year event was not the only one. Researchers analyzing speleothem records from Sorek Cave in Israel, lake sediments from the Zagros Mountains, and pollen cores from the Persian Gulf have identified a series of abrupt, humid pulses interrupting the long Holocene drying trend. One of those pulses sits suspiciously close to the 2900 BCE flood horizon at Shuruppak. The mechanism is understood. When a stalled atmospheric blocking pattern locks moisture-laden air over the Tigris-Euphrates basin while the Anatolian highland snowpack melts unusually fast, the system can produce sustained extreme rainfall and wind on a scale that no surviving Mesopotamian observer would ever see again in their lifetime. A storm so anomalous that the only people who lived through it would have been the only people who could describe it. And they did. They wrote it down. Mainstream archaeology has a counter-explanation for the alluvial layer, river avulsion. The natural shifting of river channels in flat alluvial plains, a process common in the Tigris-Euphrates system. It is a tidy explanation. It avoids the discomfort of confirming a deluge. There is one problem with it. Avulsion is local. A river jumps its bank in one stretch, deposits sediment in a localized area, and the rest of the floodplain is unaffected. The flood layers found across southern Mesopotamia are not local. The deposits at Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, and Uruk span hundreds of kilometers of separate drainage systems in cities served by different river branches, sealed at different elevations. Whatever happened in 2900 BCE did not happen to one river. It happened to a region, a weather event, the kind described in the tablet, the kind mainstream climatology has only recently begun to admit was possible. And the researcher who first tried to draw the connection between the dirt and the clay was about to discover what happens when you push too hard. In 1964, the British archaeologist Max Mallowan published a paper in the journal Iraq titled Noah's Flood Reconsidered. Mallowan was not a fringe figure. He was the husband of Agatha Christie, a former director of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, and one of the most respected Mesopotamian field archaeologists of his generation. His paper argued, carefully and with the full weight of his credentials, that the Sumerian flood traditions were anchored in a verifiable archaeological event. The dirt and the tablets agreed. The 2900 BCE horizon at Shuruppak was the deluge. The paper was cited respectfully through the late 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, it had quietly disappeared from the standard curriculum, not refuted, not disproven, just dropped. New textbooks did not mention it. Graduate students were not assigned it. The Mesopotamian flood was reclassified as literary tradition, and Mallowan's archaeological argument was filed under outdated maximalism. The pattern is familiar by now. A discovery that threatens the accepted narrative does not get destroyed. It gets buried, removed from view, placed in storage, forgotten. The institutional discomfort is not hard to understand. The problem is not that flood myths exist. Every culture has one. The problem is that the Sumerian version is anchored to a specific city excavated by a specific archaeologist, dated to a specific century by stratigraphy, and described in tablets whose precision is not in dispute. Confirming the flood means accepting that one of the foundational myths of Western religion has a real archaeological footprint. That has consequences mainstream archaeology has spent a century avoiding. There is more. The Penn Museum's original Schmidt field notes from the 1931 Farah expedition contain references to additional cuneiform fragments that were catalogued at the time but never published. Tablets removed from the active research collection and stored. Funding for follow-up excavations at Tel Farah was cut after 1931, despite Kramer's documented protests. Schmidt himself moved on to other sites and never returned. The site of the world's most famous flood, the city named in the tablets, the mound where a 60 centimeters catastrophe layer sits undisturbed beneath the desert, excavated for 6 weeks, then abandoned for nearly a century. The tablet does not just name the storm, it names what came before it. The most disturbing part of the Atra-Hasis text is rarely emphasized in popular retellings. Before the flood, there were 3 other catastrophes: plague, famine, drought, each separated by 1,200 years, each a deliberate attempt by the gods to reduce humanity, each one foiled. Only the flood was final. The tablet is explicit about the sequence. After the first 1,200 years, Enlil sent a plague. Atrahasis warned the people. They survived. After the second 1,200 years, he sent famine. They survived again. After the third 1,200 years, he sent drought. The crops failed, the rivers dried, the soil turned to alkali. Still they survived. And then the flood came, and the cycle ended. This is not the structure of a moral fable. This is the structure of a record. A document of escalating climate events logged across millennia by a civilization that watched them happen, survived them, and wrote them down so the next generation would know what was coming. Modern paleoclimatology now recognizes a series of abrupt climate oscillations across the early Holocene that repeatedly stressed Near Eastern populations. The 8.2 kilo-year cooling event, when global temperatures dropped sharply for over a century. The 5.9 kilo-year event, which dried the Sahara and forced mass migration. The 4.2 kilo-year collapse that ended the Akkadian Empire. Each event separated by intervals roughly consistent with the 1,200-year cadence the Sumerians wrote down. Coincidence or memory? The tablet's authors were not theologians inventing morality plays. They were record keepers, logging what their ancestors had survived. The storm at Shuruppak was not the beginning of the cycle. It was the climax of one. And here is where the tablet becomes uncomfortable to read. The Atrahasis text does not close with the cycle ending. It closes with the gods establishing new mechanisms to control humanity going forward. Childbirth difficulty, infant mortality, celibacy enforced through priesthood. The text reads less like the end of a disaster and more like a procedural document, a set of provisions for what comes next. The implication in the tablet's own framing is that the cycle continues. The plague, the famine, the drought, the flood, and then, after the appropriate count of years, the next event. Whatever it is. Strip away the speculation and what remains is concrete. A clay tablet recovered from a real city. A 60-centimetre alluvial layer that real archaeologists excavated under that city. A description of a weather event that should not have been physically possible in southern Mesopotamia, and a Paleoclimate record that says it was. The Sumerians were not writing mythology. They were writing field notes. Whatever happened at Shuruppak in 2900 BCE was recorded by people who watched the sky for a living and who did not exaggerate. The dirt agrees with them. The tablet stays in storage. The flood layer remains undisturbed beneath the mound of Tel Farah, excavated for 6 weeks in 1931 and abandoned ever since. Next week, I'm breaking down the Sumerian creation tablet and what it says about who built the boat. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The scribes left a record. Maybe it's time we read it.